other crisis. I can go through all the dates, but I don't think it will be of much interest to you. But if we look at the last cycles, it's quite obvious these dates, yeah? The tyranny, maybe not tyranny, but authoritarian communist regime before Gorbachev came to power. Then after Gorbachev came and until he seized the power, yeah, it was a liberalization and we are now in the middle of authoritarian stage. What will follow? If we believe in this theory, the next stage will be liberalization. When would it happen? Yeah? Usually it happens after a person in power loses his ruling position. So obviously we're looking at President Putin. What should be done to break these cycles at the liberalization and reform stage and not at the other stage in order to change this change of events which went through a millennium, no, through half a millennium at least. Negotiation, cooperation, change of stereotypes. That's quite simple and quite obvious, but I don't see any other way. What do we have now instead of negotiations, cooperations, and change of stereotypes? Political pressure and confrontation, including military confrontation, sanctions, informational campaigns in the media on both sides. So the question is, it's obviously a sort of new Cold War, but it also, many experts say that it's the beginning of a new world repartition. There was an opportunities window. As, again, Toynbee wrote in his book, Russia always was under the pressure from the West. He gives even particular years where there were invasions from Europe to the Russian territory. It changed a little bit after 1945. The threats, challenges became mutual after both sides have nuclear weapons, long-range missiles, strategic weapons. But even at that time, we all know that there were examples of positive negotiation efforts. Caribbean crisis in '62, detente in mid-70s, the final Helsinki Act signed in 1975, then nuclear weapons reduction negotiations in the 80s under Gorbachev. So real opportunities window to eliminate this natural mutual threats and pressure between Russia and the West opened after the Soviet Union lost the Cold War and fell apart. Yeah, there was a special agreement between Russia and NATO, partnership for peace, which included all the former Eastern Bloc countries, Warsaw Pact countries, joint NATO-Russia activities, etc. The window started to shrink in March '99. That's my vision, actually. First, 3 countries from former Warsaw Pact that formally joined the NATO. Also Russia, when at that time was opposing. On the 24th of March, the beginning of the Operation Allied Forces, bombing of Yugoslavia without resolution of the UN Security Council. That was really a turning point. For me personally too. The bombing of Yugoslavia, that was extremely dramatic. People in Russia have traditionally a vision of close relationships between Russia and Serbia. So it was a critical moment. And once again about Arnold Toynbee and his ideas. Yeah, I wouldn't say just read it. It looks like it was written during World War I. At that time, Russian Empire and Britain were allies in the war against Germany, Austrian Empire, and so on and so forth. And they were worried about the unity of Russian Empire at that period of time. And what Toynbee wrote at that period of time. Is it true that he was wrong? That it's now going quite different direction. Ukraine is separated, and there is no way how it could be joined together. Just as an illustration, couple of more minutes, I just can tell you a brief story of my family. My mother was born in Donetsk. My grandmother was born in Mariupol. Her sister was killed by Nazis in Kiev, and she is in Babi Yar, where is now a memorial to Holocaust. My another grandmother used to travel to Kiev almost every year in 30s and 70s, because her three sisters lived there. Several times she picked up with me to go there. And so on and so forth. My wife's father, he was born in Ukraine, in Kiev, and she spent all her childhood there in summer. And there are millions of families, both in Russia and Ukraine, with a similar history. How can I treat this situation we are facing now? I'm not happy, obviously. So that's probably the end of my story. Thank you. Again, excuse me for my English. It wasn't very clear. I'm pretty sure what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Jishwan, are we going to have questions on each one or go on to the next presentation?
Jason is muted.
Cool.
Okay, I close my presentation then.
I'm reminded of what a sad history Russia has with all the wars and invasions and so forth. People from the West have had a relatively easy life by comparison.
Take Belgium.
They've had a lot of conflict too.
Especially bad was the 20th century for the country. Several revolutions, 2 world wars on the own territory, and so on.
Yeah. Up until recently, I thought the world was doing actually quite well. So the recent events have been quite a dramatic change from a long-term positive trend, I think, at least as viewed from the West. But obviously Putin has a feeling of being besieged.
I also heard a very interesting insight about Russian, why Russia had such a vast territory. It's not because they are so aggressive, but because those territories are so cold and nobody wants to go there. The brave Russians, they pioneered into those nobody's land. And secondly, about those wars, is almost all big European forces invaded Russia. and the Russian won back. So each time they got invaded, and they got enlarged their territory, they won the war. So that's a very interesting perspective to explain the extremely tough natural environment has sort of as a context to form the national spirit of extreme self-respect. Something we didn't. Yeah, what do you say, Pavel?
Toynbee has another explanation that as far as there was always pressure of the West from European part, Russia as an empire had no choice just to expand east and south. At the east, it was stopped at some point by China, and south by Brits in the 19th century. So that's another explanation, actually.
What's the relation between your big story and the concrete events?
Please say it again.
I think you give us a very big story about Russia since the Middle Ages. And what's the relation with Putin? I don't see it.
Actually, it was written, but in small letter on one of the slides, that this idea of the imperial status of the country, it still dominates many politicians in Russia. And Putin is acting following this idea. Ukraine used to be part of Russian Empire, part of the Soviet Union. It's wrong that it's now completely under the Western influence, and it also is trying to struggle on the border. So whether it's wrong or right, but that's the vision of this Byzantine heritage of Russia. That all other partners of this heritage, they are away now. But this imperial phantom is still dominating.
Yes,
Remy.
I hear you use kind of three narratives woven together. Dus the one, I think the most immediate is like a geographical one in your last slide. Dus that access to the Black Sea, if I'm correct on my geography, dus the whole idea of not having that access is totally unthinkable. But I mean, from the Russian point of view, but then the other one that I also heard, I thought was very interesting, was just the fact that Russia, and I've studied that a little bit, was connected to Constantinople, while the West was connected to Rome, and that there is a split. The split between the two, I've always understood that as a decision-making model. Dus that originally all the bishops decided together, and only a decision was accepted if all of them agreed. And then Rome said, we're stopping doing that. We decide and you just have to listen. So they kind of introduced a paternalistic form of thinking that was like the Roman version, while there was a different type of thinking than in Constantinople. But then what I see is also an emancipation process that happened in Europe during the Reformation and the Protestant revolt, while in Russia they continued the Constantinople type of paternalistic thinking. And so maybe that is what we now see, this coming to terms with this I call it a psychoanalytical move, so to say, because the paternalistic thinking is what Freud is bringing out with his Oedipus complex. Because the child that submits to the father and then decides is going to kill the father. But it's always this cycle, as you pointed out, of wanting to kill the father at some point or submitting to the father. And that the West, I mean, I'm not saying they're successful, but we need to be paying attention to the metaphors by which we're working. And so that's where Klaus comes in. Because I think he may disagree with me, but I think he's actually working on a theory of language that is really pointing out how we use language and how we use metaphors. So that's my comment for now.
Yeah, but here we're not with the metaphors. We are with the real history, actual history. Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, the religious split. So it was the basis, starting point of confrontation. Catholic Church, Orthodox Church.
Yes.
It was already confrontation in a religion sense, but when this religion became official state religion, it was ideological support for the monarchs that they should fight West. They wanted to introduce their way of thinking, the Catholicism, and in Western parts of Ukraine, maybe you know, there is such a church which is combination of Orthodox Church and Catholic Church. Reformation in Europe, yes, it was a very important point, but at some period of history in Russia there was sort of reformation, yeah? But the reforms were imposed from the top. The patriarch in the mid-17th century, he decided to make major correction, to make new language in the books and so on and so forth. And so there are still so-called old believers who follow the previous church, yeah? And for whatever reason, there are some reasons and explanations. Representatives of this church, the merchants, they were the most entrepreneurial in 19th century in Russia. The first Russian millionaire, the old believers. So there are a lot of different things about that, but this Byzantine heritage, which came to Russia with the needs of
I think we don't have
Byzantine Empire, we should not go to these details, I think.
But shouldn't we go to Lenin and modern Russia as grounds for what is happening?
Lenin?
Yes. Why should we go all the way back to the Middle Ages? Why should we not look at the Bolshevik revolution?
Yeah, but look what Bolshevik and especially Stalin did. He managed through the lifespan of one generation to put together the empire, which fell apart completely, and to enlarge it. After World War II, the influence of the Soviet Union was very strong in the countries which never belonged to the Russian Empire, the Eastern Europe, China, Vietnam, Korea. So that was the top of the empire, actually. But it was different empire. It was communist empire. And actually Toynbee stresses that communism, the Russian communism, was a very strong weapon just to influence not only West, but the entire world.
I put a reference in the chat about a book by Weinstein and Platt about the wish to be free. It contains 2 or 3 chapters about Russia, which you might find interesting.
Say it again, please.
Oh, it is in the chat. You know what a chat? It's our common. Yeah, there is a line below. And I made a reference there to Weinstein and Platt, which is system theory. Parsons is in the background there, who have a book about the wish to be free, with more chapters, I think, about Lenin, value change in Russia, and the specifics.
Lud, are you saying that Lenin had a wish to be free, or that those
Lenin
subjugated by Lenin had a wish to be free?
So they had to develop a very complex and specific model about bottom-up and top-down control, because they also needed the population to change the system. I think there are sociological models there, that's my point, which we can use if we wish to analyze this.
Yeah, that's true. But another vision is that socialism, it was also a European idea. It wasn't born in Russia. So it was exported there and used by Lenin Bolsheviks as the basis of their ideology of communism. And it's actually replaced in some ways the religion. So Soviet Union was an atheistic state, and there was a strong effort to replace the religion by the communist ideology as the basis, also to keep the population in line with the ideas from the top.
Gary, you raised the hand.
Yes, I would like to pursue further the imperialism and its relationship to Constantinople and that form of history. Following the Second World War and the expansion of socialism throughout the East, I presume that the Constantinople version of the church followed that, at least to some degree, and that correspondingly the power of the Bishop of Moscow was enhanced. But that's probably not realistic in the sense that following Putin's ascension, the church regained its status, at least within Russia, as I understand it. So to what extent does these, if you call old beliefs, influence this relationship with the church?
Yes, there is an effort to make role of the Russian Orthodox Church more significant within the society. But it's more formal than real. I wouldn't say that it really has a great influence, not at all. This is through almost 1 century, religion was banned, formally banned. It does not mean that all the believers disappeared, not at all. But Russia is a multi-religious country. At least 3 religion, Russian Orthodox, Muslim, and Jewish, are officially or formally recognized as the legitimate, let's say so, religions. You should also keep in mind that since Peter the Great, the church was completely under the government. There was so formally a ministry of church run by a civilian, not a clergy, and was appointed directly by Tsar. And Tsar was formally head of the church, like in Britain.
What is the current status of that arrangement?
After the revolution, due to the Lenin's decree, church was divided from the state, and they reinstitutioned patriarchs. So between Peter the Great and the Revolution, during 200 years, there were no patriarchs as formal heads of the Russian Orthodox Church. So they reestablished that. They survived, actually, they survived through the Soviet times. Now it's changed. Now, but formally, patriarch is independent head of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Okay.
And formally, it's still divided from the state. Due to the Russian constitution, church divided from the state.
And does this,
Jason, can I make a couple parenthetical remarks?
Please.
Okay, first remark. It's about Siberia, which is cold, they say. I had a fortune, in quotation marks, to serve as a soldier of Russian Soviet Union in Siberia. Such a fun, okay? And I can tell you that it's not about Siberia being cold is a problem. Indeed, nothing grows there, nothing other than wild animals. It's completely impenetrable territory, okay? You cannot, it's full of insects, full of wild animals, and it's just inhabitable. It doesn't matter what you do with it, it cannot be inhabited. Therefore, you have all this territory and yet you don't have it. Maybe if China will come to rescue, maybe it will let it, free, but as in its present form, it's absolutely uninhabitable. So if you look at the map and look at the Siberia is not about cold, it's about the fact that it just cannot be inhabited, period. So therefore, basically, you have European part of Russia, which is habitable, and the rest is not. It's this so-called expansion is only in the south of this region, Khabarovsk, Vladivostok, etc. But the north is not inhabitable at all. Let alone, of course, that in the winter it could be very, very, very cold. That's one question, one item. Another item is about you mentioned about Peter the Great. I immediately recalled. That by the time when Peter the Great came to Europe, in London, Handel was fully staging his greatest opera, and then Gluck and so on and so forth. I am not even talking about science at that time. At that time, Russia was 200 years behind West. Okay, make it very clear. Now, by necessity, yesterday I just downloaded something, book on mechanics, two volume. This is a set of lecture notes by Darboux from Sorbonne in Paris. Okay, it was translated into Russian in the year 1906. Okay, Russia was completely behind in all this knowledge. It was taking it all from the West, through and through and through. Russia always wanted to adjust itself to be like a West, but never actually had a chance to be like a West, because West never wanted actually to take Russia completely, as equal, always as a younger boy, just a beginner, never fully complete. Okay,
that's why we are here reflecting why this is so.
Well, this is so because it is lagging 200 years in mentality. Putin mentality is still 200 years behind. You have to understand that. I mean, all these ideas, okay, like, for example, 21 or 22 years of reign of Putin. What is this? Why this is so? Because
let's hear the other two presentations.